Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Director of Webinars for Tech Channel, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation, Making the Most of the IBM Audit Journal. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but feel free to ask a question or submit a comment at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. You may download a PDF version of today's slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources and selecting the slide deck. You'll find that on the left side of your screen, and know that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Fortra. Our featured speaker is Amy Williams, Principal Security Services Consultant at Fortra. Amy holds CISSP, CISA, and PCIP certifications and is an IBM champion. She's dedicated to enhancing client security and mitigating risks. Her expertise in IBM auditing has enabled numerous customers to achieve robust and secure IT environments. So we've had a lot of interest in today's webinar. So without further ado, Amy, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you for the great introduction, Janine. I really appreciate it. We do have a lot to get through today, and I want to leave time for questions, so we're going to get started. Today, we're going to cover configuring auditing, what our recommended settings are so you can really make the most out of that audit journal and what it can do for you, how you get all of the information it can collect, how you can actually get that out into some useful format. And then I've got some real-world examples of how using that data you can troubleshoot issues on your systems or just in general find out what's happening on your system that might not be as obvious by looking at Work Active Job or looking at QHIST. So when we talk about auditing and those configuration considerations, because it can use up storage, processing is not a consideration really anymore. So maybe when I started back in Power 4 and before that, but now with Power 8, Power 9, and certainly Power 10, performance has not been a consideration, but storage always will be. So we want to talk about why you're going to have that data, what its purpose is going to be, how sensitive the data might be that's being collected, who's going to be able to access that data. So we'll talk a little bit about how it gets accessed, what the requirements are, and then how and who should it be shared with. Where are you going to store that data? So you have some choices about storing the audit journals and when you save them, where you're going to store them, how long you're going to keep them, and then what those entries are that are being created. And not only what entries are being created, but what does that data mean that's being collected? And lastly, what should you really hang on to? So what should you keep around for maybe a little bit longer than some of the other items? So when we talk about the auditing, what does it actually let you see? So it's going to let you see security relevant actions. So these are changes to ownership, creation of user profiles, and some more authorization list changes, changes to authority of objects. So really letting you know how the objects are being managed. And then we can also look at specific objects and how they're being used. Are they being open for just reads? Are they being open for changes? So not at the data level, but at the object level. And then we can also see if an object was changed. So was the authority of the object changed? Was the description of the object changed? Were the attributes of the object changed? And this comes in quite often in the IFS when you're looking at the different attributes of those objects. So with that, we're actually going to kick right into our first polling question. So I really want to know if you have auditing turned on. So it always surprises me a little bit working with new customers when they haven't even considered turning auditing on. So we're going to let this go for a minute so we can see what that looks like.
Great, Amy.
Now,
we already have some responses coming in, but let's give it another few seconds. I think we'll
Super.
get some more.
And, always with this, I will admit that I thought it was just on by default when I started out. I didn't realize that it was something that you had to turn on and take into consideration. And that's because I was working with high availability logical replication in most of the shops that I ran and was responsible for. So there are a lot of shops out there. Oh, yeah.
Should we go ahead and launch these results?
Yeah, let's.
Okay, we'll do. Here we go.
So it looks like the majority of you do have it turned on, which is fantastic news. A few don't, so you'll be interested in what considerations to take to turn that on. And then, of course, a few you aren't sure, and we'll let you know how you can find that out too. So just from going into configuring that auditing, it's all about the audit journal. So you're going to hear those words come out of my mouth probably more often than you think during today's presentation, because it really is all about the audit journal. So there's 3 ways that we can have data fed into that audit journal, which is also considered the security log for the IBMI. So we have system value settings that we'll be looking at to collect data at a system level. You can turn auditing on specific objects, so you can collect specific things about specific objects. And then we can also turn on a special command auditing value on user profiles. So that is one that cannot be set at the system level. It has to be turned on at the user profile level. So when we look at the audit journal, it is the facility that those entries get passed through to then what could be referred to as the log file. So those are the receivers. So you're always going to have a receiver that's currently attached, and that is the one that the data is being written to. And then you're going to have journals in that chain. So you can see I've got Audit Journal Receiver 2 and Audit Journal Receiver 1. So as those receivers change, and those can either be changed on a timed basis. So again, if you've got high availability configurations in, they're probably changing your journals on a time basis along with a threshold. So a size threshold that gets met, and then the system itself will change those journal receivers. Then what I've had happen for a few customers is they'll set the system to auto-delete those receivers upon change. And unfortunately, what that means is as soon as you hit that threshold, it's going to change your journal receiver to the next, and immediately you lose that data that you had just written. So we're going to talk about some ways that we can avoid that and about managing the size. And so you can get the key entries in there without necessarily compromising your system. So one of the great things, or a few great things about the audit receivers, are they can't be modified, right? These are not database files. These aren't text files. They are journal receivers. So they cannot be altered with any type of data editing tools at all. So the data that is written into those journals is not going to be able to be changed after it's written. Now, the risk is, I just mentioned, is they get deleted, right? You've got to manage your space. You can't keep them forever. We'd all love to have petabytes of storage, but we don't. So when those are deleted, the data is gone. So having a strategy for saving these receivers before they're getting deleted is super important, because you can restore them and read through that data as if they had never been removed from the system itself. So monitoring that size and what's going on really comes to this next piece about how we configure the audit journals. So first piece is our system values. So the key system values we're going to look at are QAud control, QAud level, and QAud level 2. So these three really control how much data is getting logged into your system. And we'll talk about some ways you can find out what the most noisy activity is on your system later in the presentation. So with QAud control, there's a number of settings that you can configure this with. Now, star none, that means it's just turned off. So even if you do a work object for the audit journal and it exists, doesn't necessarily mean that you have auditing turned on. So you really need to look at the system value QAud control. If that has any values in it other than none, you are actively auditing some activity on your system. So object odd value, that's going to give you activity against objects, reads or updates to those individual objects. That's going to be logged. If that's all you have turned on, you're not going to see invalid sign-on attempts. You're not going to see changes to user profiles, created objects. You get those types of entries by including odd level. And by turning on odd level, that is going to point the system to the odd level system value that we're going to examine next. Now, no QTemp, this can certainly help reduce some of the noise from the audit journal. You can put no QTemp on, so you're going to eliminate those activities happening in QTemp. But be aware that whether you have no QTemp in that value or not, create activities and delete activities in QTemp are not logged to the audit journal ever. So what can we do with this QAud level? And I know that, we've already got a comment out there about how much disk space these audit journals can take up. And I know back, when I was managing systems and we were hitting that, 85, 90%, the first place we went was deleting those journals immediately, right? So we got a little bit better at what we were doing, got a little bit more space allocated, and so weren't fighting the fires as often. But I really learned that putting in just the things that I needed, so I knew if a security incident was happening, I knew if somebody was moving things around, those key activities I had to have, so I figured out how to have those in and eliminate some of the noise. So the values I put here are what our best practices recommend, and I have an extra one in there. This one can get super noisy, so I do caution you, if you turn it on a Monday, watch your storage, learn your system, realize what you can and can't have. But that very last value of nettel server, that will actually tell you all of the telnet connections coming into your system. So you can see who's connecting through telnet, and this is a very useful tool when you're trying to get to secure connections. So there's different ways you can use your audit journal. The really key values you want to have with no exceptions are going to be authority failures, the security events, right? Those are user profile changes, creates of user profiles, the create and delete of objects, right? We need to know who's creating things on our systems. And gosh forbid, who's deleting things. I can't tell you how many times that came up as who deleted that file or who deleted that program or library, and we had to go and track it down. Star service, that one's going to tell you if people are going to service tools. And I got to tell you, that shouldn't be very often, so that is not necessarily a consideration about space. PTF operations, those just help auditors and let you know if you have your system being managed by a third party. When they load PTFs and they've told you everything's up to date, hey, make sure. Take a look and see what PTFs actually got loaded and when. The next ones are the noisy ones. So the job BAS, that can get super noisy and busy and take up a lot of space when you've got a lot of jobs starting and ending. So this is the only way, though, you can really see interactive logons on the IBMI. IBM doesn't necessarily have a authentication activity or entry. So to find those, we use that job BAS security value. And then object management, this is all your renames and all of your object moves. So this is how I would track down when somebody said that they put something in one IFS folder, and yeah, that was not the IFS folder that they moved that document to. Object management will let me get to that kind of detail. And then save restore, it will be noisy if you're running this on your dev systems most often because you're restoring things, saving things. So that shouldn't be too noisy, but it can add to that storage requirement. So odd level 2 is really just an extension of QOD level. So if you're really getting down in the nitty-gritty and getting some very finite activity being logged to your audit journal, you may need to use odd level 2 system value so that you can put those additional attributes in for collecting that additional data. So if you haven't started auditing, we had a few people out there that said they don't have auditing turned on yet. You can turn that auditing on with a command of change sec odd. And then after you've done that, certainly, you still have to set the values into odd level. When you've gotten comfortable with where you're at, you can start identifying additional objects. And that's where this piece comes in. So if you have sensitive files, payroll files, configuration files, you can turn additional auditing on without having to turn auditing on across all of the objects. So that object management piece, if you don't want monitor object management for all objects across the system, you can turn object auditing on for just specific objects, and you'll be able to retrieve those same types of activities for those objects. So again, controlling the amount of time, amount of space that you're taking up in the audit journal. And then changing auditing on IFS files, right? So it's a little bit of a different command for the IFS. It's just change odd. And again, you can do that for an entire directory. You can do it for a whole directory tree. I don't recommend it because sometimes those can get really chatty and noisy. But if you do have configuration files in your IFS, if you have objects that should not be being changed, I highly recommend turning auditing onto those so you can keep track of any changes that are happening and who made those changes. So how does auditing get turned on those things in the first place? There is a system value that may or may not create havoc for you, and that is the QCreate object odd value. So with this system value, if it's set to star change or star all, any object created on your system, regardless of the library, will have auditing turned on to that object. This can fill your audit journals very quickly, especially with data queues in some of the applications out there that I've seen. We've also seen it on files that get all turned on. Well, now every time somebody opens that file, reads a record, runs through that file, makes any change, you're getting hundreds of thousands of entries for those files. So I do caution you turning object auditing on at the system level, and really recommend you looking at turning it on at the library level instead. And that will allow you to just change the auditing for any objects being created in those really important libraries that you have. Now, IBM has done some awesome updates to the Navigator for I. So just to know what entry types are going to be available for you depending on what values you put into QOD level, they've now put this in a really nice spot in Navigator. So if you go into security and you go into the auditing configuration, you can see if you've turned on auth fail, you're going to get data from all those different types of entries if those activities happen on your system. So this is an awesome cheat sheet. It's also covered in a table in the security reference guide, which is kind of my guide that I have open every day, all day on my desktop. So an easy way to figure out if you've got that kind of activity happening on your system. With, again, the user auditing, this is that special one that I told you about at the beginning, where at user level, you can turn on all the same auditing for a user that's turned on at the system level. So if you don't want to log jobs for all of your users, but you do want to log QSec offer, any contractors that might be on your system, all of your elevated profiles and your administrators, you want to know when they're logging onto the system, you can turn that on at the user profile level only, so you're not logging everybody's jobs. And the one that can only be turned on at the user level is the star command value. And that will log any and all commands that those profiles are running. And that is whether they are running them interactively or they're running them through batch jobs. So again, I caution turning that command value on to any service profiles or profiles you have, running your batch jobs, because that can exponentially fill your audit journal with activity. So recommended settings, right? How do you get started with this? How do you know where you're at? So our recommended settings are really having all three of those eligible values in QAuth control. So object auditing, looking at the audit level, and no QTemp, right? Eliminating that noise. If you can handle the activity in QTemp also, by all means, you can, leave that one off. And then for the key ones in odd level, and this is a little bit of a repeat, but I really want you guys to kind of understand where we're coming from, and this is for your ability to see the activity on your system. We want you to be able to see authority failures. That's going to, be key for not just object authority failures when somebody's trying to access something they shouldn't, but also those invalid sign-on attempts. You can do a lesser value of star security with just secconfig and secrun, which will give you, again, changes to user profiles, changes to configuration objects, changes to system values. Star security covers a little bit more, and I have not seen a significant difference in the amount of events being collected using either those two values or just the single security value. Creates and deletes, it's key to know what is getting created and what's getting removed from your system. Save restore, knowing what's getting restored to your system. Service, if somebody's going into service tools and if they're using a service tool, right? That can get into some low-level debugs. It can cause some havoc with your system. So knowing what's happening there is really important. And then program fail is one only if you are not running Q security level 40 yet. So if you're at security level 20 or 30, program fail is the one that is going to expose those possible halts that would happen when you move to security level 40. And then again, I touched on PTF operations. That's going to let you know what and when actually got applied to your system. So for the users, and I really want to kind of drive this home, is vitally important we know what our users are doing on the systems. So with command auditing turned on, it's really for those users that have command line access, right? So anyone that's not limited capability star yes, so whether it's partial or it's no, we recommend turning that command auditing on. If it's a batch profile, it really shouldn't be logging in interactively, and it shouldn't need command line access. So kind of take those things into consideration. And then the job BAS, again, if you can't handle auditing all jobs, which some of your systems are that busy, and I get it, right? You cannot, maintain terabytes of audit journals because your systems are so busy. Turn that job BAS or even job data on to those profiles you really want to keep track of, and shouldn't be running all the jobs on your system and shouldn't be on all the time, because this is how you can be alerted that they are being used, and hopefully that matches up with your change process and somebody knows that they were actually supposed to be on. So I mentioned that there's that change secaud command, and hopefully I mentioned we'd get to it, but this is how you can turn it on for the first time. So it does everything for you. So if your audit journal doesn't exist yet, it's going to create it for you. If it does, it's going to just update the system values. You can set what values you want to start off with. So if you just want to start off with security and nothing else and see where that gets you, great. Then you can add, create, you can add, delete, authority failures. You can add those on over time. The changes to those system values happen immediately. You don't have to IPL. You don't have to start and stop anything. As soon as you take the value out of there, it's going to stop auditing those activities. As soon as you put it in, it's going to start auditing those activities. You can decide where those receivers should go. And I inadvertently, on my slide, put it in QGPL. I don't recommend putting these receivers in QGPL. I recommend putting them in a unique library at the top of the save. So maybe something that starts with £, so they're getting saved right off the bat when you do your full system saves. And that command, in one fell swoop, will get your auditing started for you. Again, my recommendation is Mondays, right? Let's turn this on Monday. Let's watch it. Don't turn it on a Friday. Would hate to have you come into a system that's, rocking and rolling at 88, 90%, and now you got to scramble to do something. So we've talked about getting the audit journal created, all the different settings, what that information should be, but now how do you actually even look at the journal information? So again, this is going to bring us up on our next polling question, because I want to kind of get a feel for where everybody's at in this journey for that. So do you look at your security events right now? And if you do, how are you doing that?
So Amy, it's Janine again.
Yep.
I know our attendees are going to want a copy of this slide deck. So if you join late, I just want to let you know to check out event resources on the left side of your screen. Click on that drop-down menu. From there, you can select the slide deck, and you can download these slides right now, right from the platform, without being disconnected from the webinar. So be sure to check that out. And Amy, we have results coming in. I want to give it one more update before I launch to the audience.
Great. No, this looks good.
Yeah, let's go ahead and launch them.
So it looks like the majority of you are doing this manually. So we'll talk about a few of those different manual ways to do it. Great to see that we've got some SIM users out there and are able to access that data that way. Third-party software, there's a number of choices out there for you guys, so that's awesome. And external service, so I am seeing that more often now, so certainly want you to be able to validate that they're doing what they say they are doing for you. So let's get into getting that data out and how that data is kind of structured. So in that audit journal entry, you are always going to have header information, which is going to have the job, the user, the entry ID, the date and time of the activity, right? That is no matter what entry type you're looking at. If it's an authority failure, a create, a change profile, that header data is the same. After that header data, the layout of those audit journal entries is different for every single entry type. So keeping that in mind, again, I'm going to reference the security reference guide. because it has all those layouts out there so you can see what those different fields mean. But IBM's starting to make this even easier for us to get to. So when we look at these audit journal types, we can see when the job started, and then there's the job user, which I have highlighted at the top, which can often be different than the actual profile that's doing the work. So you'll see this most often in ODBC connections, so those I call them the QZ DASONIT jobs, right? Q user is going to be your user, and then you're going to see the actual user that's doing the work. So it's important to make sure you're looking at the right fields. In some of the data, there will be up to 3 or 4 user profile fields to look at. So the IP address is another key point that you want to keep track of, right? So if we're getting a lot of invalid sign-on attempts, we want to be able to bring that forward and know where those invalid sign-on attempts are coming from. And again, this is a critical one. You want to make sure if you do have a SIM that you're sending those PW entries to that SIM. So super old school, right? You can just do display journ and see the audit entries and do a 5 and a 10, and you can see the detail and try and figure out what's where and what means what, but that's not a lot of fun. So what I like to do, rather than doing the display journ and the F10 to see what the job was, I use the copy odd journ entry. So this is a fast and easy way to get the data for a certain amount of time for one or multiple entries into files that you can then query. So it will build a file in QTemp or the library of your choosing, prefixed with QAudit, and then suffixed with the entry types you chose to display. So then you can run the query over that table, and you can pretty much figure out what's going on your system. But is there even an easier way to know what those fields are? Again, that security reference guide, I'm going to keep kind of repeating things, so hopefully they kind of hit home and you guys take away some of these with you today. This security reference guide is going to tell you exactly what those fields are, what the values in the fields mean. So if you get an authority failure that has a K-type entry, what the heck does a K-type mean? Yeah, it means somebody was missing a special authority for that activity. So again, it goes through all of those pieces from that security reference guide. But IBM's made it easier. So now we have SQL views. And there are new SQL views coming out all the time. So the first iteration of this is what I've got on the screen today. It was pretty high level. You could get the entries out, but a lot of the data was kind of obfuscated. So they've now created actual services. So with using the journal services, and they've got just about every entry type now available, with the newest PTFs that were released in, I think, October, and maybe some additional ones in December. You can run a SQL statement directly against your audit journal using either a time-based with a start and end time or a current timestamp calculation and get out the data from your audit journal. So there's no temporary table getting created. There's no having to download things or write additional queries. You can do all of that now directly through those SQL services. And I'll have some more examples in the last section of the slide deck. So the way I generally run these is through ACS, Run SQL Scripts. So if you're not on ACS yet, I suggest you download it. And from the Run SQL Scripts, just some good tips for you is to open up that JDBC connection and make sure that you're translating that CCS ID so that you can ensure to see all of the data normalized so it actually is in readable format. It bites me every time, so I decided I'd finally put it in my presentations to remind others so they don't get caught by the same thing I do. And then in the edit, under examples, And again, if you keep up on your ACS updates, you're going to get more and more examples for these SQL services all the time. So all I did was open up Edit and Examples, and in there I just typed in the word AUD, and you can see I've got the journal services for AF, CA, OW, and PW, which are great ways to get started using those SQL statements and being able to get the data directly out of your audit journal. Again, no intermediary. Now, just a note about ACS, they are continually updating it. Please try and keep up with those updates. So the latest version, as of this presentation, was 1197, and that was built in November of 24. So it does take care of a number of CVEs that have been reported in regards to ACS. So again, doing those updates and getting ACS, keeping it up to date and patched, super important if you're going to use it. So we all need to be responsible for how we're affecting our environments. All right, so now here's the good stuff. So how do we actually make these entries worth all the storage that they're taking up on your system? So I've mentioned this already a couple times today, invalid sign-on attempts. So invalid sign-on attempts, if your IBMI is exposed to the internet, hopefully it's not, but if it is, this is a really good way to know if somebody is actually trying to brute force attack your system. We've identified these things a number of times working with customers where they didn't realize that their system was exposed to the internet, and somebody had come across the IP address because it was out there, and they were just hammering it with, admin and root and all kinds of different user profiles that were coming up. So you'll be able to see, is it a bad password or is it a bad user profile? What IP address is that actually coming from, right? Super, super important to keep track of. You might have a misconfigured PC or a service out there that the profile no longer exists for. Being able to track those down are really important. So here's that service tools statement, so you can use that to pull those entries directly out. The next one that I want to talk about are authority failures. So again, if all of our stuff's configured right, things are going well, we shouldn't be seeing authority failures on our systems. So again, keeping track of what normal behavior is on your system and being able to see what's failing, if things are failing, can be super important. Another nice piece that they put into those services is they've put in fields that normalize what that activity is. So you can see it's a not authorized object or it's a special authority violation. Now that K type and A type are still available in those views, but again, this makes it a heck of a lot easier for somebody that's not familiar with IBMI or not familiar with the audit journal to be able to know what this authority failure really meant. And it breaks it down already into that library and library and object format, and then that object type. So they've done a lot of the work for us to make our lives as easy as possible. So another example is probably used the most of all are the CP entries. So when we're looking at profiles, right, we not only want to know when profiles are getting created, but when they're being created, are their passwords actually meeting the composition rules? So there's ways to force profiles to be created now with that password meeting the composition rules. I would say the majority of shops still aren't doing that, but there is still a way to know in that CP entry if that password met all the composition rules. So you can see in my two examples, and this is using the copy adjourn version, we can see that in the top, the sysval means that that profile got created and the password did not meet the composition rules. If it passed, well, then it passed. And it means that password did include all the composition rules. The other thing that you can see is what special authorities were given to that user profile. So all object was given to one of those profiles and SecAdmin was given to another. So the other example of that, and again, I really liking using these services. It's making it so much easier to see what's happening. You can see all of these things really at one time. So you can see where SecAdmin was granted, all object was granted. 2 of those profiles were not compliant with the password compliance, and then 1 was. So another example that you'll be able to use, hopefully from the slide deck when you download that, just to get you started, poking around and seeing what's happened. So probably the biggest tip I have for you today, and one of the things that I have used really for the last 10 years, trying to identify what's filling up the audit journal. My audit journal is growing. I have hundreds of receivers. But you don't know what that activity is that's taking up that space. This statement that I've given you here will go back for one day, for the previous day at midnight to the previous day at 11:59, and it counts how many entries of each high-level entry type happened. So you would be able to see, in this example, PS or profile swaps, and that's because this system I was doing this on has thousands of ODBC connections happening. And every time you do that, you're swapping from Q user to your user. So those profile swaps can get noisy. And then I had job entries. I had connection entries. The IP or for the IFS, and then SG or sockets. And then I had 428 deletes that I had to go and track down. Something else that you might find is if that system level value of QCreateAud has been turned on and it's set to start change, and you have objects getting created and deleted every day, and they have that auditing turned on, and they're busy little objects like data queues that handle a lot of in and outs, you might see an entry type of ZC at the top of this list. Well, I suggest you drill down into that to see what those objects are and turn that auditing off, because it's not actually going to buy you anything. So in this example, I drilled down on those deleted objects to see what it was that was being deleted. So I introduced the object type field into it. So now I can see of those deleted objects, 427 were stream files. And then I had one file, a directory actually got deleted, and then there was some cleanup done. So performance data was cleaned up in management tools, right? This detail, again, you can use the calculated timestamp, which is what I used in my previous one, or you can actually explicitly define what that starting and ending timestamp is. So if you want to look at a specific hour or set of days, if you can do that, you can set that beginning and ending timestamp to be able to do that true drill down all the way into what those entry types are. And I want to get through the next few examples here. So another way of looking at that so that you can copy and paste those out of the presentation, hopefully, and use them. Being able to drill down and see when those activities are happening can be really important. So what I did here is I just tried to find what time frame those entries were actually happening. So it gave me that they happened throughout the entire day, which unfortunately didn't help me as much as I was hoping. Another one that is important, and I mentioned this a few times, is that job BAS. So is a profile signing on? What jobs is a profile using, right? You're going through your events to try and clean up jobs, and you've got this profile, and it shows that it's being used, but you don't know how. Turn job BAS onto that profile, and you will be able to start seeing that. So in those job entries, it's going to tell you if it was a submitted job, if it was an interactive job, if it was submitted by another user. and then you'll be able to get those reports out. So I've done some more examples in here so you guys can use those in your own environment. So this one, I found that a job was getting submitted by a different user, and it was elevating its authority because of the way it was able to do that. And I was able to track down something else that was happening inappropriately on a system. So again, I'm hoping these real-world examples can help you guys find things in your environment that maybe you weren't readily aware of. So this is an extension of that report where we saw that user low actually went as gotcha, and it was done right from the command line. So if this was done from another program, you'd be able to see what that program was that was allowing them to elevate. And lastly, we'll touch on these CD entries. So if we want to talk about noise and things that can take up space in your audit journal, I talked about object auditing, right, which is going to be those ZCs. We also have ZRs. CD entries can also be super noisy. So I caution you on what profiles you turn these on, but it is super useful. So when I look at what commands my elevated users are using, I can see what they're running on the command line versus through programs and make sure that those are appropriate. And it'll show me the full command string along with what parameters they passed with it. And lastly, we touched on this, moving to security level 40, turning on program fail security will allow you to see informationally what could become a halt if you change your Q security level to 40 from 20 or 30. There's obviously some more considerations to take into account with those changes, but this really is a great way that IBM has allowed us to see what's going to break before we actually suffer the consequences. And then these are the reports I'm going to recommend that you run at least periodically, right? So looking at your authority failures, the command entries, creates, changes to profiles, the QSEC offer resets, job entries for those elevated profiles, if not all, invalid sign-on attempts, use of service tools, and then any changes to system values. And because they're my least favorite entry type, I left them for last. Those ZR and ZC entry types, super high level, don't provide you a lot of data, but boy, if you're really trying to track some down, they can be invaluable by turning on that auditing. And with that, I've got our last polling question today, Janine.
I've just launched it.
So I'm wondering how you could use the audit journal in your day-to-day. And I supplied some options. Hopefully they hit home for some of you. Well, that's awesome.
Response is starting to come in, Amy.
Yeah, so off the bat, all of the above, which is fantastic to see that. And certainly having a more focused view and starting at a more focused view can be a great way to start because it can be overwhelming.
I'll go ahead and launch these. Okay.
Yeah, so the majority of you do say all of the above. Changes to user profiles are high on that list, authority failures, and then that interactive job review. Curious, nobody chose invalid sign-ons to review, but really that all kind of, hits home and will take care of all of those pieces. So last, I've got a few more slides here about debugging problems, right? So I would run into storage issues, or I'd have tickets getting opened on my applications, and people are saying everything's failing, things are broken. Being able to turn on auditing to those users that are having those experiences can definitely enhance what's being audited and what you can see in the activity-wise without having to change it for the entire system, right? If you're already fighting a fire, you don't want to create a new one. And then there are many entries now that include before entries in those audit journal entries. So auditing changes, so you know if auditing's been turned on and off to an object, what that value was previously. So if it got changed from star all to star change or none, you would know that. Invaluable before entries on changes of user profiles, so you know if special authorities have been being added or removed, if their job description got changed, if their user class got changed. So something to take into consideration. And then certainly, I've mentioned it probably more than a few times, that IBM Security Reference Guide, looking at Chapter 9, really deep dives into those security auditing journal entries and what they mean, what those values are that are going to be created. The object operations. So what object operations actually cause auditing to happen? And it walks through the reads and changes. And then F is the layout of all those files. So again, if you're feeding those into a SIM or if you're trying to parse it out yourself, that can give you all of the specifications that you need. And with that, I do invite anyone here to participate in our free security scan and review to kind of see where you're at and where your system's at security-wise. If you haven't taken advantage of this yet, I encourage you to. And if you have, certainly would love to talk to you again and help you through this security journey that is never, unfortunately, just a checkbox, but is a continuing event for all of us all the time. So with that, do we have any questions? I've tried to leave some time here.
We sure do, Amy. I'm going to go back, though, and anchor us on that free security scan, in case people are interested in that. So we talked a lot about auditing journals, growing, the amount of space they take, etc. So this one might be a good question. It's like, what do all these audit levels do? We have them all turned on in addition to your list. So let's take a moment if you recognize these. Net update.
Yeah. So generally, I will say for the ones that are listed in that question, so we've got setconfig, net update, attention events, net socket, and set secure. So the net UDP is what that actually is, and that's all the UDP connections to your system. So that I usually only have turned on when I need to troubleshoot something that says it can't connect and I can't figure out why. It's not something I would generally have on all the time. Attention event, that's a good one to have turned on. So that is the built-in intrusion detection IBM has.
Okay.
Net socket and the net secure, I'm not familiar with the set secure, but the net socket, again, is going to be every socket connection, which is going to be super noisy. I only use it for troubleshooting. And then the net secure, that's going to be your secure telnet connection. So if you're converting over to secure communications, that's going to help you see who's actually making those connections.
So helpful. Thank you. The next question is it recommended to have separate libraries, journal receivers for Q, Aud, Journ, and database journals?
The way I've configured my shops, I always had my system journals, so the audit journal in a separate library from my database journals. And I know that sometimes the database journals had other requirements depending on the application you used for high availability. And again, for save sake, right? So you may not be saving your database journals on your source system. You're only saving them on your target. you really want to be saving your audit journal receivers on both systems all the time. So it does make those saves easier having them in separate libraries.
Great, thanks. So we've talked about the whole space issue because one of our questions is about that. I think we've kind of addressed it and how perhaps you can use less space. How about this question? How do you know who is using different commands?
So using the different commands is going to be, if you've got specific commands you want to monitor, like we have a lot of customers that have SOX reporting requirements, so they're super curious about that job scheduler that's on the IBMI. So we'll turn auditing on to add job scheduler entry, change job scheduler entry, and those specific commands. So we'll turn all auditing on to those commands specifically so we can see who's making those changes to the job scheduler, for instance. So if there are commands that are sensitive to you or to your applications, you can turn that auditing on using that change object odd command, and turning all on. And those will show up in the CD type entries.
Okay. If in the system value, now correct me if I've got these wrong, QOD level $create is specified, does it log any object being created no matter which user it was, or is it also depending on the audit level set on the user profile?
So if you have $create in QOD level, it is going to log any object being created regardless of who the user is, except for those objects created in QTemp.
Got it. Okay. The only other one I kind of just wanted to get your comments on, this person says that they have a complex SQL that shows who answered a QSys OPR message, how and when, and it's been invaluable. Any comment about that?
Yeah, no, they are certainly opening up even more examples out there. So I will, give creds to Scott Forsty, who is fighting the good fight with his team and publishing new services. It feels like sometimes by the day. And there are more work management things. I think they're coming forward. So those QSysOpera messages, I haven't had a chance to play with that service yet. But again, if you're looking for what's happening on your system, you don't want to ignore any resource that is available to you. So, certainly looking at those QSysOpera messages can be important.
So, Amy, can we go back to that? You kept referencing Chapter 9 of the security. Yep. Because our last question was, are there any supplemental resources you can recommend to learn more about the audit journal and ways to use it? Looks like this is a great list.
Yeah, and this is certainly where I would start. It lays out what the different pieces mean as much as possible. And then again, using that resource within ACS that's kind of built right in can get you started also. IBM has definitely done some really great enhancements in Navigator also, making it easier for us to get to this information.
Great. And just a reminder, if you haven't already done so, probably in the last minutes, so Misty, you might want to, if you haven't already done so, go to Event Resources on the left side of your screen, click on that drop-down menu, and select the slide deck so that you have this. And with that, Amy, that's all the time we have for today. This has been outstanding. I think we gave our viewers some great takeaways. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and I especially want to thank Amy for sharing her insights and expertise with us today. Later this week, watch for our follow-up email. It will contain a link to the recording of today's webinar so you can watch it again or forward it to your colleagues and leadership to view on demand. Get all the latest on all things tech by going to techchannel.com/subscribe. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.